In this section, we're going to look at some of the things that affect the price of a particular product or a particular service. So the first thing that we'll look at then is we'll look at demand. Demand, the total number of goods that are wanted by customers at a particular price. Notice it is not the number of goods that are wanted by customers. It's the one number of goods that are wanted by customers at a particular price. There are lots of people who would probably want to have a luxury sports car. But if you were to say, OK, and you'll have to spend $100,000, the number now would drop substantially. So it's not the number of people who want something. Lots of us want things we can't afford. It's how many people seriously want them at a particular price. Now, demand comes from two places. Direct demand is obviously you want to buy something, I want to buy something. Whereas derived demand is what you often get with companies. So let's say, for example, we're talking about cars. Well, there is direct demand. In fact, I'll do this the other way around. That make more sense. There is a customer, that's you and me, who wants to buy a car. Therefore, the car manufacturer will need to buy a windscreen. They will need to buy some tyres. They will need to buy some steel to make the car out of. There are lots of things the car manufacturer then has to buy. But we don't want them, not directly. I don't go out and think, oh, I want a new windscreen. I don't go out and say, I want some steel. I don't go out and say, I want some rubber. I go out and say, I want a car. And then the car manufacturer will then have to buy all those raw materials. Now, that means, of course, that the people, the companies who make the windscreens, the people who manufacture the steel, the people who manufacture the tyres, are affected by the demand for cars. Even though I'm not buying their products directly, if the demand for cars goes down, they are affected as well. Demand for cars goes up, they are affected as well. It's similar in the construction industry. The demand for houses might go up and it might go down. But if the demand for houses goes down, so does the demand for all the people who provide things that houses are made from. So the demand for bricks goes down. The demand for plumbers goes down. The demand for electricians goes down. The demand for showers and baths goes down. Not that any of us think, oh, I need a plumber, or I need some bricks. But if you don't want the house, you don't need any of those either. So derived demand can affect products. The demand curve is basically what happens, what is the link between prices and the quantity of products which are required, which are demanded. Now, normally the way we do this then is the higher up you go, the higher the price. So this is a low price, this is a high price. The further to the right you go, the bigger the quantity. So this is a low quantity and this is a high quantity. And obviously what you would expect, low price, high quantity. So there is one particular place that we have. And similarly, high price, people will buy less, low quantity. And there's another combination. Now you can see that there is a link between the two. Sometimes it's done as a straight line, sometimes it's done as a curve. It doesn't really matter, to be honest, for our purposes. The idea is simply that for the majority of products, if the price goes up, the demand goes down, and vice versa. If the price goes down, the demand goes up. That's the demand curve. Now, there are various things that affect demand. So, for example, the one that we are looking at is the price. The price obviously affects it. The higher the price, the lower the quantity. We've just said that. But also, what about alternatives? What about substitutes? A substitute product is something you could buy instead. So, let's make sure we're happy about this. Let's imagine that the price of a substitute goes down. So you are thinking, the traditional example that we have is we have something like butter and margarine. The price of margarine goes down. What happens? People would rather buy margarine. What happens to the sale of butter? The sale of butter declines. So we have a situation at the moment, butter, margarine. If margarine prices fall, people want to buy more. If people want to buy more margarine, they buy less butter. The price of butter hasn't changed, but the demand has, because the price of something else has changed. Similarly, complementary goods are ones that you tend to buy as well. So again, I was talking about cars earlier. So cars, when you buy a car, you will often buy, or at some point you will need to buy new tyres. The tyres wear out. So if demand for cars goes up, demand for tyres goes up. So if, for example, cars become more popular, then similarly, complementary goods, tyres become more popular. If cars become more popular, the stereos that go in cars might become more popular. So again, the demand for something might go up because demand for something else has gone up. Demand might go down because the demand for something else has gone down. The size of income. People can only buy things if they can afford it. So if people are becoming wealthier, in general, demand goes up, but demand for certain products might go up faster. So, for example, a good example at the moment is that in China, the income of a lot of places is rising. So people can afford to buy more things. But not only that, they can afford to buy the good quality things. So at the moment, China is one of the boom areas for luxury goods. People have got more money, but instead of spending it on lots of different things, they want to buy certain things. So the size of household income can affect your products. And obviously it's the same in reverse. When people have got less money, they will stop spending on certain things first. So if my wife and I had less money, we would still carry on buying bread. But there's other things we would stop buying. So size of income can affect demand. Social trends. You saw this in pest analysis. So things become popular, things become less popular. And finally, what do we think is going to happen in the future? We might buy things now, even if the price is high, because we think the price is going to go up even further. Unfortunately, that tends to be true of house prices. Some people buy houses to live in. Other people will buy houses as an investment. They will pay a lot of money for a house if they think it's going to become even more expensive, and they can then sell it and make a profit. Now, you notice that certainly these middle ones don't actually have anything to do with the price of our product. There are other things that will affect it. Now, we said we had a demand curve, and we said when prices go up, quantity comes down. Price elasticity is calculated by how much does the demand change by, as a percentage, over how much has the price changed by, as a percentage. Now, if you have the demand curve that we had a minute ago, the price elasticity at one point may be different than a price elasticity at a different point. So what we will need to be calculating in the exam then is what's the percentage change in the quantity over the price. So price elasticity, price goes on the bottom. So we'd have to look at the percentage changes. 10% change in the price has resulted in a 20% change in demand. That would give you a price elasticity 20% over 10%. In other words, a price elasticity of 2. That could, of course, also work in the opposite direction. So you could perhaps have prices going up, you could have prices going down. Now, the big thing here is how much does it change by? When prices go up, demand always goes down. But by how much? So let's have 2 examples. Let's have price 1 and quantity 1. So there's our combination. At this price, this is how many people want to buy. Price goes up by a little bit. That hasn't gone up by very much. But the quantity has fallen dramatically. So you can see that the quantity has fallen a lot, even though the price hasn't gone up by very much. So the price has changed by a little bit, but the quantity has changed by a lot. If you were to look at the percentage changes, we'd have something like I've got there, 20% fall in demand, 10% rise in price. That is called elastic. So that one is what's called elastic. Now, in that case, if you were to put your prices down again, price would go down a bit, but demand would shoot back up again. You're probably better putting your prices down. On the other hand, you notice I've made a little change there because I got it wrong. On the other hand, there'll be certain things where you put the price up a lot, but demand hardly changes at all. You get a very steep line. That's what's called inelastic demand. So your price has changed a lot, but demand's hardly changed at all. These tend to be, so this is inelastic. You tend to get inelastic demand for things that are necessary. Transport costs. Even if transport costs go up a lot, most people still pay them because they don't really have any choice. So things where people will tend to carry on buying them. One of the reasons why governments of all types put taxes on cigarettes is they know that, to be honest, cigarette smokers will probably pay even if you put the price up. So a few won't. A few will say, I'm going to stop smoking because I can't afford it. But most people who smoke are going to smoke whatever the price is. So you put the price up. Inelastic. Now, in those kind of cases, you're actually better off putting the price up. And you find taxes often are on those kind of products. Elastic products, on the other hand, are often things that are luxuries. And people are maybe very sensitive to them. Put the price up a bit and that's it. Demand collapses. In which case, put the price down. Inelastic, put the price up. Supply. We said that demand was how many things customers were willing to buy at a particular price. Supply is how many things producers are willing to supply at a particular price. Now, if you remember, when we had the demand curve, it went downwards. The supply curve is obviously going to go the opposite way. If you can only get a low price for something, very few people are going to bother making it. If you can get a high price for something, lots of companies are going to want to make it because they know that they will make lots of profits. So the supply curve tends to go upwards, whereas the demand curve tends to come downwards. And that leads us on to the market price. Well, how do we know what price is actually going to be charged? And the idea is we have a supply curve. We have a demand curve. And at one particular point, those two lines cross. That's the price, and that's the quantity. So in other words, at that one point only, exactly the same number of suppliers as purchasers, as customers. So if the price went up a little bit, there'd be more suppliers, but unfortunately, there'd be fewer customers that wanted them. So obviously what would happen is goods would be left unsold. So that wouldn't work. Suppliers would start dropping back out again because they would think, why am I going to make something I can't sell? And similarly, where that blue line is, there aren't enough products, so customers will bid the price up. I really, really want that. I'm willing to pay extra. Price starts going up. There will be suppliers will say, oh, there's extra money to be made. So at one point only, those two exactly match, and that's what the price will be. When we're talking about supply, we're talking about the price that people can get for their products. But of course, we're also talking about how much it costs them. And there are two kinds of costs that we need to worry about: short-term costs and long-term costs. So in the short term, some costs are fixed. A fixed cost is like that black line. In other words, the fixed cost is the rent on a building. If you make, or a rent on a factory, you make a car, you pay £100,000 in rent. You make 10 cars, you still pay £100,000 in rent. You make 1,000 cars, you still pay £100,000 in rent. In other words, the cost is fixed against the quantity. Quantity changes, cost doesn't. There are other costs, variable costs, where the more you make, the more you need to spend altogether. So you make more cars, you need more rubber for the tyres. You make more cars, you need more windscreens. You make more cars, you need more steel. So the costs will go up. Now, that's all fine. But what else we need to think about is what happens to the average. So this is, what I've got here, is the total of those costs. But what happens to the average? Well, I hope you can see that the average fixed cost will actually come down. You spend £100,000 on the rent of a factory and you make one car. So you make one car, the average cost is $100,000. If, on the other hand, you made 100 cars, now the average, you're still spending $100,000 in total, but it's now being spread out over 1,000 cars. Your average is, 100 cars rather, your average is now only 1,000 each. If you were to make 1,000 cars, your average falls to 100 each. So the same fixed cost is being spread out over more and more and more and more items. The average is coming down. The total variable cost, let's imagine, again, I'm just making some numbers up. Let's imagine it's $500 per car. The more you make, then fairly obviously, the more cost you're going to get. But the average will actually stay as 500. One car is 500, 2 cars is 1,000, which is an average of 500. 10 cars is 5,000, which is an average of 500. So the idea is that your lines are going in different directions. So your fixed cost becomes a curve, your variable cost becomes a flat line. So in the exam, be very careful. Are we talking about total fixed cost, horizontal line, or average fixed cost, curving down? Are we talking about total variable cost, line going up? Or are we talking about average variable cost, horizontal line? You can see, I hope, if you were to put those together, then the cost falls the more that you make. And that's known as economies of scale, which we'll mention again in a few minutes. So the total cost is going to go down the more things you make because of the fixed bit. I told you we were going to see it again. In the long term, all costs are variable. In the long term, you can negotiate the rent on the factory. In the long term, you might well be able to replace workers on a salary or a fixed cost. In the long term, you could replace them with machinery and turn them into something else. So in the long term, everything ends up like the one on the right. But in the short term, you have a mixture of the two. Now, if you were to say to me, how long is the long term? I can't tell you. It depends on the industry. So in some industries, it might be a year. In other industries, it might be 10 years. The key thing is, in the long term, you can change pretty much everything you want. Now, we said earlier that when you have a market, you will get a price. The supply curve, the demand curve will cross each other at one place. There will be a price, there will be a quantity. That's not always true. The kind of market where that is going to happen is what's referred to as a perfect market. And in a perfect market, there are lots of suppliers and lots of customers, so the price can settle down to where those two lines cross. So, what we're looking for? First of all, no supplier has an advantage. In other words, most of the suppliers are about the same size. Because otherwise, one big supplier could perhaps potentially influence the price. There are a large number of them. There's lots of buyers, there's lots of sellers. Again, individual firms, that's customers as well as suppliers, can't do anything about the price on their own. The products are all the same. So it doesn't matter who I buy it from, it will be the same. Now, that's important because otherwise you might have products where the prices are different because the products are perhaps better somehow. In a perfect market, everything's exactly the same. Doesn't matter who you buy it from. And finally, anybody who wants to sell the products can. Free entry. Anybody who decides they don't want to sell the products anymore because the prices are too low can leave. Free exit. Yeah, and that allows for this price to settle down at where there's exactly the right number of customers and suppliers. Now, how often do you actually get a perfect market? In theory, you get them a lot, particularly in a capitalist economy. In practice, they're not as common as you would think. But if there is a perfect market, which is one of the things that we assume in economics that there is, then this price sorts itself out. Nobody has to choose what price is going to be. The market adjusts for it. In an imperfect market, there might be a few large companies, perhaps a few large customers, or perhaps even more likely a few large suppliers. That is often known as an oligopoly. An oligopoly, there's a limited number of customers. Now, there will be some competition, but there won't be a lot. That would, for example, be the electricity industry in the UK. So there is some competition, but because it's a difficult industry to get into, because the costs are so high, there's not that much competition. So prices will generally tend to be higher than they would be under a perfect market. Monopolies, monopolistic, there is only one supplier. And they will tend to earn what's called supernormal profits. So they will earn more money than they should do. That's because prices will tend to be high. Why will prices be high? There's only one supplier. And that supplier, to a certain extent, charges whatever they like. Monopolies are particularly damaging when it's something, again, which is necessary. Companies, or customers rather, have to buy water. They have to buy electricity. They have to buy certain products, and if there's only one supplier, that company can charge what it likes. So again, prices will be higher. One of the things that governments in lots of countries have done over the past 50 years is they've taken monopolies and they've tried to break them up. They've tried to introduce competition, go from a monopolistic market at least to an oligopoly, where there is at least some kind of choice. And of course, the problem is if there is a monopoly, A, prices are high because you've got no choice. B, quality doesn't have to be very good because you've got no choice. So governments have tried to introduce competition in certain industries. Now, are monopolies good or bad? Well, generally they're thought of as being bad. However, one thing is, because they are a monopoly, they can spend money on R&D, particularly when research and development is a big cost. In the car industry, there aren't that many big car manufacturers. There's probably only about 20. The Americans, the Japanese, the Germans, a few others, but there aren't that many. But of course, so they earn more profits than they probably should do. But one of the things they'll do, they'll invest it in research and development, because it costs a lot of money to research a new car. It costs a lot of money to research the technology. Similarly, pharmaceuticals companies. There probably aren't that many big pharmaceutical companies in the world. But you could argue that's an advantage, because they have the money to research new drugs. If there were thousands of pharmaceutical companies all making a little bit of profit, they wouldn't be able to research anything, because research costs money, and there'd be drugs that nobody ever discovers. Similarly, they might find it easier to raise capital, and therefore they can build big factories. So although monopolies are generally thought of as being bad, there are some advantages to